In this video I wanted to talk about the for loop, and I've left up the code from my previous video on the while loops to show a comparison of how they look. Okay, so let's get started with this. Now, a for loop is obviously a way of looping, and what we do is we use something called for. Now, let me just review the while loop before I begin. In the while loop, we create a variable counter outside of the loop. And then what we do is we set a condition and we say while, and then we give some condition. In this case, we say as long as the counter is less than 10, keep doing this. Right? And then we have some body thing that we want to continue doing, and then after that we also have to have an incrementer to increase the counter. If we didn't have the incrementer, what would happen is that the counter would just wouldn't change, and then the body would just keep repeating into infinity and wouldn't stop. Now, the for loop is a convenient way to handle all of these in one go. Okay, so let's take a look. So the way it looks generally is like this: for int counter is equal to 0. Okay, so what we did is we've created and initialized a counter, so instantiated, which means to create, so instantiated and initialized a counter. Okay, follow it with a semicolon, and then we provide the condition for continuing, so we say counter is less than 10. Okay, and then we provide the incrementer counter plus plus. Okay, and then what we would do is we would provide the body for this, and we would say something like cout hello world. Okay, now these two are exactly the same. Okay, so this does the exact same thing as this. Okay, now there are a couple of differences. One notable difference is that the counter here is created inside the for loop. So after the for loop is finished, this counter would be destroyed, right? And so you wouldn't be able to use the counter afterwards. Whereas in this while loop, the counter was created outside of the while loop, so after the while loop is terminated, the counter would still persist and could be used again. Now, if you wanted to use the counter again, what we could do is you could initialize the counter outside of the for loop in this way similar to the while loop, and we could say for counter equals 0, or in this case we could just say counter. If you wanted to initialize it or set it to be a certain value at the beginning of the loop, you could say counter equals 0. Okay, and then you wouldn't have to initialize it here. Okay, so these two now are exactly the same. So int counter equals 0. Here the counter is set to be 0. Counter is less than 10, counter is less than 10, counter plus plus, counter plus plus. And they even have the same body. Cout hello world, cout hello world. Alright, now for the most part, you can use a while loop in place of a for loop, or a for loop in place of a while loop. It doesn't really matter. However, in my experience, a general rule of thumb is that when you're using when you're in a situation where you are trying to program something where you don't know how many times something is going to happen, that's usually the time to use a while or a do while, right? And when you know how many times you want to loop, that's when you use the for loop. Alright, so to give you an example, if I wanted to repeat my name, say 7,000 times, then I would use a for loop. If I wanted to keep repeating the name as long as the user was pressing the space bar, then I would use a while loop or a do while loop. Right? And the difference is that I don't know how long the person is going to be pressing the space bar for, and so I have no idea how many times that's going to be repeated. Alright, so that's a general rule, although both can be generally used in a different, like in place of each other. Okay, so just a couple specifics about the for loop. This is a very simple one. It's a good idea to get used to counting from 0 to less than the number, although some people like to go from 1 and then say less than or equal to the number. Right? The reason why I prefer to have 0 to less than the number is because this will work with better with something called arrays later on. Right? The other thing is that the counter, the incrementer, does not have to go up by 1. It could, for instance, we could go from 10 and say greater than 0 and say counter minus minus. Okay? You could also do something like this: counter equals counter minus 2, and that would decrease the counter by 2 every single time. Or a shortcut would be to say minus equals 2. So counter minus equals 2, and that would decrease the counter by 2 every time. Alright, that's pretty much it, except for I'll show you one other thing that's useful with for loops. I'm just going to return it to how it looked before. And that's what's called a nested loop. Okay, now normally, let's say I have factor 1. Okay, so let's say I wanted to do 2 factors. So in factor 1 is less than 10, and factor 1 plus plus. Okay, what we can do is create something called a nested loop. And you can do nested while loops as well, but they're not as common as nested for loops. Now, a nested for loop basically looks the same, okay, except it has one for loop inside of another for loop. Or you could have triply nested or 4 times nested or whatever. Okay, so you can have 1 or 2 inside of each other. Okay, and I just changed it to factor 2. Alright, so what I can do here is I could just say something like this. Cout factor 1 times factor 2. Okay, so what we have here is a situation where we are going to create something like that looks like a multiplication table. Okay, and I'm just going to clean this up a bit. Okay, let's take a look and see what happens with this. Okay, so there we go. We have 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Okay, and you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and this is a very common thing. It looks like a multiplication table. Alright, now the reason why this happens is because what happens is we have factor 1, which starts at 0. Okay, and then factor 2, while factor 1 is 0, factor 2 goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then stops because it becomes 10. It ends, and then goes out to the outer loop, and factor 1 becomes 1. And then factor 2 goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, ends, and then comes back to the outer loop, and factor 1 becomes 2. And that way you can use this, you can use a method like this, a nested looping method, to explore all the different combinations of 2 things. Okay, so for instance, if you wanted to do all the different, look at all the possible combinations of 3 different things, then what you could do is you could use a triple nested loop, and it easily goes through all the different ways of, all the ways that those things can be combined in sequential order. Right? It's a very, very useful way of looking at large amounts of data, and a very, very useful way of looking at number combinations as well. So, as I said though, the for loop is probably the most commonly used loop, although some people prefer whiles or do whiles. The main distinction I found that works is if you know how many times you want to loop, use a for loop. If you don't know and you're waiting for something to happen but you're not sure how long it's going to take for that to happen or how many iterations it will take for that to happen, then go with a while or a do while. Okay, and that's really it. In the next couple of videos, what you're going to see is some core algorithms, and you're going to see these basic constructs put to use. And hopefully those will help you to understand how these are supposed to be used and how they can be effective in programming. Anyways, if you do like the video, please consider giving me a thumbs up, and if you do like my channel, please give me a subscription. If you have any questions, then please drop an email in my inbox, or put a comment in the comment section.